You may wonder what it is that I do all day, and that my life should be dull and insignificant. But there's much more about me than you could ever learn from merely watching me sleep and clean my paws with my tongue. Of course, I do not work a job, for I am a cat, and my needs are taken care of, but even if I was homeless, I should take care of myself by eating birds and mice. No, of course I do not want to eat birds, but if I had to, I know that I could do it. I have no job, I have no friends, and I have no responsibilities. But that does not mean that I have no purpose and no reason for living. My forebears ate rats so that I would not have to, but could merely walk around my house looking beautiful, just as there are humans that survive by special attributes but exist only to be admired. Cats are not nearly so arrogant and ignorant, and many a humble cat humbly accepts what is given to him with a simple knowing glance. I have come to believe that the thing that makes life worth living is memory. And those with the greatest memory live some of the greatest lives. But I am referring to good memories, of course, and not bad memories. Not memories of terrible and cruel things. Not memories of murders and house fires. Memories are important for correlating events in order to make sense of the incomprehensible. Without memory, everything would be worthless and useless, and nothing would be important. Everything would be backwards and upside down, for memories give order to events that they do not happen in reverse. Sometimes we lose our memories. I have known some of these persons, and some of my guardians have lost their memory, and I would sometimes be deprived of food for days because they had forgotten that time was moving forward and not in reverse, and that just because they had fed me last week does not mean that they should have fed me today. I have never lost my memory, and I am thankful that each new day is not the first day of my life, and that I should need to learn to speak all over again. Without memory, each day is like a new day, and each moment is like something new. Cats without memory are like newborn cats. I know this, for at one time I had no memory beyond the most simple needs and desires. Well, I hesitate to even begin this subject. But cats with 9 lives are able to make some sense of it all. But when one's memories encompass all things, even a cat such as myself is able to make connections of disparate things, and in this way understand everything. I have come to realize over many years that humans often remember things that never happened in real life, but only that they can remember what is inside of their imagination for such a thing to be true. And so it is that humans like to form into larger groups, and that in such a way memories are experienced by others, and that they be accepted as truth. I am a solitary cat. I have no friends. So I have come to trust the things which I remember are also true. I have known cats that have overactive imaginations, and they believe that the events that happened in their imagination also happen in the real world, exactly like humans that jump out of windows because they believe they can fly. Yes, I once lived with such a man. Again, he too was an expert in his field. He studied the human mind. I often heard him talking about it with his colleagues. Not, however, the entire mind as a thing in and of itself, but only the fragments of the mind of individual people. And this always seemed odd to me, as if by studying a constituent part of a thing, the whole thing could be known. He smoked cigars all day and all night, and I hated it. Stinky, nasty habit, smoke everywhere. Anyway, I still remember how much I hated it. And that was many lifetimes removed from today, so I have been justified in my distaste for his nasty habit because I hate it to this day. Dee does not smoke, however, and I am very thankful. What I started to say before remembering that nasty cigar smoke was that this man with whom I shared a small house with was a doctor of the mind. I didn't really know what a doctor was. Everyone called him doctor, so initially I thought that was his name, but it seemed to carry with it a large amount of respect, just for the privilege of being one. So I figured that he must be extremely smart. But he wasn't. No, he wasn't very smart from what I could tell because he didn't do anything. All he did was talk. But I never saw him do anything at all except smoke and talk. Smoke and talk, smoke and talk. Yes, I hated his particular idiosyncrasies, but many lifetimes later came to understand that this was a common thing for that smart persons should talk and that others should heed their words without question. But at this time, I did not understand the hierarchical structure of authority. So I began to question the motives of my new owner. The way these encounters worked was always the same, though he referred to them as sessions. Someone would enter his house, which I soon learned was his office, unannounced. But he would never act surprised, but instead as if he had expected them all along. He would then offer his visitor to lie down on a bed and sleep while he lighted a cigar and began to prepare his own mind to apply his expertise. Then he would begin to ask questions to his visitor, and when they were answered, he would ask follow-up questions, and in this way probe the mind of his visitor. Sometimes, at his coaxing, the visitor would describe their dreams, and this always interested the doctor, as if he were in fact probing the mind of his visitor through their dreams. I thought that this was very strange, because I often dream of killing rats, even though I have never killed one. After a while, this sequence of events became routine, and I was able to lie on the rug and listen to his probing questions without fear or apprehension. But it was his visitors, which I later found out were called patients, that I worried about, for I thought that they were not getting much out of their encounter than he was. He was writing things down on pads of paper the whole time that they would be speaking, and I wondered if they were being misused. Yes, he would write and write and write, all the time smoking his cigar. And when they would stop, he would look up and ask them to further elaborate. I didn't know, but I was beginning to suspect that he was pandering to them, and that his thoughts were really about something very different than their dreams. This cynicism began to fester in my own mind, and that is when I decided to confront him. He sat in a chair writing. He was smoking another one of his cigars. I was feeling a bit tired, I remember, because I was up half the night wandering the house restlessly. The smoke was heavy in the air, and I said, "Why do you smoke those nasty cigars?" He looked up from his book instantly, and I thought, slightly annoyed. Then he looked at me carefully, and I wondered if he was daring me to ask him again. "Why do you smoke those nasty cigars?" I said again. He looked at me for a long time without answering. Then he stood up and went to a thin table which was set against the wall. On it was a decanter from which he poured about a third of a glass of liquid before putting an ice cube into it. He drained it with one loud gulp. Then he poured another glass and went to the wall. Next, he wiped his face with a handkerchief taken from his coat pocket and daubed his face. I could hear him breathing heavily. Finally, he put his cigar out in an ashtray on the desk. Then he looked at me again. His eyes were watery, and he looked confused. I waited for him to answer my question and merely watched him intently. I could tell that he was wanting to say something, but that he was struggling with the idea of speaking to me. I began to take offense to his condescending attitude in which he tried to pretend that I did not exist. So I watched him as my own ire began to rise. A moment later, he walked slowly to his couch, which his visitors were encouraged to lie upon, and he lay down on his back and let out a sigh. I was convinced that he was ignoring me, just as he had ignored his own visitors, so I jumped up upon the chair which was placed next to the couch, and I looked him in the face and said, "The least you could do is answer me when I speak to you." His eyes were closed, but upon hearing me speak to him, he opened them again and looked at me. I could see a slight smile on his face, but I do not think it was from mirth, but instead, a form of nervousness. "You are a cat," he finally said with disgust. "You are a house cat." I knew I was a house cat, and he obviously knew I was a house cat too, so I concluded that he was demonstrating further his disdain for me. So, in response, I countered his disdain and said, "Tell me, how long have you known this?" Now he was getting very angry. "Stop speaking," he shouted. "You are not a person." "There is no reason to get angry," I answered. "Tell me about your hostility to cats. Try to relax," I said softly. Relenting to my request, he let his head fall to the pillow. I could see his breathing return to normal as he tried to relax, and as if succumbing to an unavoidable fate, he began to speak in a different way, a way that made me apprehensive. "I have always been afraid of cats," he said. "Back as far as I can remember, I have avoided them." "But I am a cat," I said calmly. "You said so yourself. Tell me more about this dislike of cats, because I am beginning to suspect that your dislike is really a dislike for something about yourself. If you can bring this anxiety to the surface, I may be able to help you, for I fear that you may be suffering from a form of transference neurosis." He did not answer. I waited for an answer, for I was beginning to like my line of questioning, just as I had seen him do so many times to his visitors, which he referred to as his patients. After a few minutes, I looked more closely at him, and I realized that he was asleep. He was never the same after that day, and I noticed that he was becoming more reserved in his speech, more aloof. We would say hello to one another when we would pass each other in the house. We were cordial, but that was all. He avoided looking at me as much as possible, but he always fed me, and each morning he would put out a saucer of milk. My boldness had earned his respect, but it had done something unexpected, and he no longer wanted to see me. He no longer seemed arrogant to me, for I noticed that even in his sessions with his patients, his demeanor was different, guarded. At night, I often heard him talking to himself. He would ask himself questions and then fall into a rage when he couldn't come up with an answer. I thought that he was breaking. I thought that he was coming apart, and I worried about him. One day, two men wearing white coats came to speak with him. At first, the conversation was friendly, but soon I realized that something odd was happening. There was much cursing and shouting and much noise from falling chairs, until I saw the two men carrying my benefactor out the door, wearing a jacket that did not fit him well at all, but seemed to be very tight and restraining. I kept out of sight because of something which I could not understand. It was a feeling of fear, danger. As for my benefactor, I never saw him again. But the two men in white coats came back again a few days later. They carried a cage with them, and the sight of this cage caused the fur on my back to stand up once again out of an undefinable fear. Suddenly, one of the men brought out a plate of food and placed it on the floor where I could see it. Of course, I was hungry, for I hadn't eaten in days, so I was thankful for the chance to eat again. I walked to the plate. It smelled great, and I took a mouthful of food. That is when they struck. They seized me and stuffed me into the cage before I even knew what was happening. I struggled until I realized that all resistance was pointless. Then I lied down and waited to find out my fate, but somehow I knew what it would be. I was murdered with the greatest care and gentleness, as if the murderers were reluctant to murder me but were simply following orders. And so, wearing thick gloves, one of the men removed me from the cage and held me tightly. The other man stuck a sharp needle into me, and I felt warmth spread throughout my body. But I was so utterly tired that I fell asleep before I saw what happened next. But even as I have died, so it is that I am reborn anew, and that I have learned from my experience. Did I bring this horror upon myself? Perhaps it is my mouth which gets me into so much trouble. I believe that this is probably true for humans as well. But sometimes I just cannot control myself, even though I know that it is wise to do so. Lessons in life, it seems, are slow to be learned. And sometimes our mistakes lead to disaster, and we are not able to learn from them. I have been blessed, it seems, because the greater the disaster I am forced to experience, so much greater are the lessons I take to my next life. But how many more times? This is the question which often wakes me from my most satisfying naps. Udo.